I extend a very warm welcome to all and my greetings on this auspicious occasion of Navratri. Uh, I chose to speak on thyroid ophthalmopathy today because it is one area which in the past decade has undergone a lot of changes as far as the understanding of the disease is concerned, as far as the approach to management is concerned. It has been affected tremendously by the radiological advances that have occurred in the field of the CT scan and the MRI. And a very important impact has recently been seen in this COVID time, in the COVID pandemic. I mean, you will be surprised to know that there is a significant population which has suffered COVID and has turned out to be hypothyroid after the episode is over. So, this is the added importance that we have now attached to this disease. So it is commonly called as Graves' ophthalmopathy or thyroid eye disease, or recently has now been started to be referred as thyroid associated orbitopathy, TAU. Now it is noteworthy that although the thyroid gland and the orbital tissue, they share the same antigenicity, yet the thyroid dysfunction may occur either current or prior to the onset of orbitopathy, with a stage of disease that may be either hyperthyroid or euthyroid or hypothyroid. Women are more commonly affected than men, and the male female male ratio is 5 is to 1. Now, amongst the risk factors, smoking by far is the most important risk factor. Smokers of the European ethnicity have 2.4 times increased risk as compared to their Asian counterparts. And it has been noted that active smokers require more strabismus surgery as compared to the non-smokers. The other risk factors of importance are diabetes, life stresses, radioactive iodine therapy, positive family history of autoimmune disease, and increasing age. Now, it being an autoimmune disease, the antibody mediated reaction against the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor is actually the basis of this whole gamut of reactions that takes place. The T cell lymphocytes react against the thyroid follicular cells with shared antigenic epitopes in the retrobulbar space. Whatever is present in the thyroid gland is also present in the retrobulbar space. So if you see from here, basically the orbit has orbital fibroblasts. And these orbital fibroblasts, they possess a lot of developmental plasticity. That means they can change their form depending upon what influences they undergo in terms of different enzymes in different cytokines and other stimulating factors. So they can differentiate either as adipocyte tissues, which cause fat hypertrophy, or else they can go into the other leg of the table and where CD40 receptors are affected. And then these orbital fibroblasts, they engage with the T cells, which are bound to CD154. This upregulates the pro-inflammatory genes, the PGE2, the IL-6 and IL-8, and then ultimately this gives rise to the synthesis of glycosaminoglycans and hyaluronan. And these then get deposited onto the muscles. So if you see it diagrammatically here, the fibrocyte, which actually is born in the bone marrow, travels through the blood, comes into the orbit. And here this fibrocyte changes into the fibroblast. And this fibroblast, under the various influences, ultimately differentiates into the adipocyte or into the myofibroblast. This is another very beautiful pictorial representation done by Garrity. So here again, it's the same thing that you see, that this area is the area of the orbit. And here you see that the orbital fibroblast, it gets activated and releases chemokines, which again causes inflammation. When this is attracting the T lymphocytes here, this leads to adipogenesis. And when this is affected by the IL-6 and other production of GAGs, then it leads to proliferation within the muscles. So you see there is an interaction with the T lymphocytes as well as along with the inflammatory cytokines. Other than this, the insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor, the 15 lipooxygenase 1 and the cyclooxygenase 2 have also been implicated in the pathogenesis of thyroid ophthalmopathy. A variant in the IL-23R gene has also been strongly associated with tau. Now, currently the role of clathrin-mediated signaling pathways, the palmitate and the thyroid 1 surface markers, these are currently under study. So now that we know that this is an autoimmune-based disease, it is very natural that it may be associated with other autoimmune diseases like myasthenia gravis, Addison's disease, vitiligo, and pernicious anemia. Interestingly, the Yersinia enterocolitica infection has also been found to have an association with tau, although this is not immune mediated. Now, when we come to the disease per se, we need to understand two concepts. One is the concept of severity, and the second is the concept of activity. So let's come to the concept of severity first. So severity basically means the degree of functional or cosmetic deficit. And it includes both the primary phenomenon that are happening in the orbit and the secondary phenomenon. Secondary phenomenon means what is happening because of the primary. So what are the primaries? The primaries are changes in the muscles, changes in the fat, and changes in the connective tissue. What are the secondary changes? The secondary changes are that we all know that this bony orbit is a firm structure. And within this, around the muscles is the fibromuscular septae. So along with this, we have the venous drainage. So because of changes in muscle, adipose tissue, and connective tissue, all these affect the expansion of those tissues. Something like compartmentalization. Now, what is the concept of activity? Activity is that something is active inside. And what is that activity? Activity is inflammation. So this inflammation, therefore, is causing the structures to change. And therefore, it is dynamic. There is a potential for change. So this inflammation may be spontaneous and it can reduce in response to immunomodulation. Now, because so much is happening, a lot of people have tried to classify the disease. That we should be able to include both activity and severity in the actual representation of the disease form. So this NO-SPECS classification was the earliest classification. And this is an acronym which stands for no physical signs or symptoms, only physical signs and symptoms, soft tissue involvement, proptosis, extraocular muscle signs, corneal involvement, and sight loss. Now, the drawback is that is purely showing you clinical severity. It does not provide any means to distinguish between inflammatory or non-inflammatory stage of the disease. So this went into disrepute. And then came the visa classification, which is the vision score, inflammation, strabismus, and appearance score. So here you see both activity and severity are taken into account. And this is a huge chart. So you have this, all the four, the V, the I, the S. This is the V, the vision, the inflammation, the strabismus, and the appearance. So everything gets documented in this visa classification. Dolman and Rootman in 2006 gave the visa inflammatory index, and anything less than 4 out of 10 is managed conservatively according to them, and anything more than 5 is requiring aggressive therapy. The clinical activity score is actually a composite of a first time evaluation and a follow-up. So the first time evaluation is done under 7 headings, 7 points, divided into 3 headings: pain, redness, and swelling. 2 for pain, 2 for redness, and 3 for swelling. So 1 each. So a score of 7 is the first time visit. And then in the second visit, if there is a progression of more than 2, it is 1. Again, if the movement decreases more than 5, or the vision decreases more than 1 line, everything happening in the period of 1 to 3 months from the first evaluation. So the CAS score has 2 components, the first score component and the progression component. Active ophthalmopathy is a score of more than 3 upon 7 at the first examination or 4 upon 10 in successive examinations. Now, the UGOGO classification divides thyroid ophthalmopathy into the mild, moderate to severe, and sight-threatening. And the VISA and UGOGO are the 2 most widely used grading systems because they assess both activity and severity. Now, this much I have elaborated because this forms the basis of our clinical decision making. So it's very important. Symptoms are usually gritty eyes, protruding eyes, which may be unilateral or bilateral, retroocular pain, gaze-evoked pain, swollen or puffy eyelids, diplopia, and in advanced cases, there may be diminution of vision and inability to close the eyes. The signs, thyroid ophthalmopathy is associated with a lot of named signs, basically Dalrymple, Von Graffi, Vigro, Stellabag, Groves, basically meaning that eyelid retraction, lid lag in down gaze, eyelid fullness, incomplete and infrequent blinking, and resistance to pulling down the retracted upper eyelid. That means there is some amount of fibrosis which takes place at a later stage. So here you see all the variants of eyelid positions. So lower eyelid retraction, minimal upper eyelid retraction, huge upper eyelid and huge lower eyelid retraction. Here again, it is asymmetrical. The left eye has has upper lid retraction, but no lower lid retraction. And here again, you see the right eye has upper lid retraction, bilateral upper lid retraction, and no lower lid retraction. So symmetry is not necessary. Although the disease is systemic, the presentation may be asymmetric. Absence of creases on the forehead, poor convergence, restriction of one or more extraocular muscles, and deep glabular rhytids are again features. Now, something which very commonly gets missed in thyroid ophthalmopathy is the evaluation of the cornea and the conjunctiva. Friends, here I would say that please do not overlook the caput that forms in the region of the limbus. This deep congestion that you see, there is a corkscrew-like dilated episcleral vessels. This has a very, very high indicator. It is a very high indicator of the presence of thyroid ophthalmopathy. thickened swelling over the medial or the lateral rectus muscle. In fact, superior limbic keratoconjunctivitis is one of the most important prognostic markers. Now, see, this is a very unfortunate case which I have dealt with. You see, this eye came to us in this form. He developed a corneal ulcer, and wherever he was treated, actually, they never saw the thyroid ophthalmopathy. And unfortunately for this man, he again developed corneal involvement of the right eye. This image is of the right eye. The fluorescein staining is of the right eye. So you see how bad it can get. It can actually lead to perforations. The strabismus is common, and in the advanced stage, when the inflammation has finished, it leads to restrictive myopathy. Compressive optic neuropathy, of course, is the most dreaded sequelae of the thyroid ophthalmopathy. Intraocular pressure is known to rise, a rise of more than 8 millimeter in up case. This is normally occurring because there is dilated episcleral venous pressure, and this venous flow is decreased. And there is also deposition of glycosaminoglycans in the trabecular meshwork. The natural course of the disease is one that has an initial active phase, then a quiescent phase, and then of course it goes into the fibrotic stage or the dying down stage, and this is called the Rundle's curve. It usually takes about, from the time of start of disease, 1.5 to 2 years for it to reach the plateau. Now, recurrence is known. Reactivation of thyroid eye disease is defined by recurrence of inflammation and signs and symptoms after a period of stability. So it doesn't mean that once you have taken care of the disease, it will not recur. It has its own phases of exacerbation and quiescence. The most important investigations are the thyroid hormone levels, which we have to keep in mind may not necessarily correlate. The serum TSHR autoantibodies correlate positively with the clinical features of Graves' ophthalmopathy. The thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin shows more significant association with clinical features of tau than the TSH binding inhibitor immunoglobulin. And these are regarded as functional biomarkers for tau. The thyroid peroxidase studies associate eye findings with thyroid abnormality. Now, in radiology, the CT and MR, both are equally important. MR is more sensitive for soft tissue changes, but CT scan will be required if you have to perform a bony decompression. We'll come to that later. And the signs that you see on either CT or MR are the typical Coca-Cola sign that the belly is thick and the tendons are spared. Now, the involvement of the muscles in coronal section you are seeing may be asymmetric not only amongst the two orbits, but also within the same orbit. You see the inferior rectus muscle, so much larger than the other muscles. Bilateral lacrimal gland involvement is a feature because this is an autoimmune disease. You see, because of the congestion within the orbit, the superior ophthalmic vein gets dilated. There is an increased orbital fat volume because of the adipogenesis. Can you notice this distance between the medial rectus muscle and the eyelid? See how it is bulging? And how much the fat around the optic nerve has increased. Apical crowding of the optic nerve and straightening of the optic nerve are actually dangerous, signs of danger. This is an MRI showing you beautifully how the fat is enhanced. You see how large these fat packs are. These are the T1 and T2 weighted images. Histological changes that occur are fibrosis and degenerative changes in the muscles. lymphocytic cell infiltration, enlarged fibroblasts, mucopolysaccharide accumulation, interstitial edema, and increased collagen. Now, embarking upon the treatment, it has two very important components. One is the supportive treatment. Friends, you must remember that for thyroid ophthalmopathy, supportive treatment forms an equally important part as far as the definitive treatment is concerned. The medical therapy includes anti-inflammatory in form of topical steroids for mild cases. You may need steroids for advanced cases. Immunomodulators in the form of monoclonal antibodies like rituximab or TNF alpha antagonist like infliximab. Now, I would like to share this little algorithm with you. So once you have decided that your disease is mild or moderate to severe or sight-threatening, then you have a protocol to follow. In the mild, you will do all these supportive therapies, like you will control the thyroid status, you will give the patient an antioxidant, selenium, I'll come to it. You will use lubricants, you will give non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, you will ask the patient to quit smoking, and you will, if there is retraction, which is significant and causing either functional abnormality like dryness, or is it of cosmetic concern, then you would do treatment accordingly, either by steroid or botulinum toxin. Once these patients have received this, you will keep them under observation. If they fall into the moderate to severe category, then you will start with low dose intravenous methylprednisolone pulse therapy. You will load with 500 milligrams for 3 days and keep them on a maintenance dose of 500 milligram thrice weekly for 5 weeks, such that the cumulative dose should not be more than 4,000 milligram. If your patient responds, well and good, keep him under observation. If he doesn't respond, then you will either choose a low dose radiation if it's available, or else you will go in for immune modulation. If the patient has a sight-threatening disease, this is an emergency. So you have to use high doses of intravenous methylpred pulse therapy with a loading dose of 1000 milligram for 3 days, with a maintenance dose of 500 to 1000 per week for 6 weeks. Here again, if they respond, don't leave them, put them on immunomodulation. And if there is an inadequate response and the vision is threatened, then you need to go in for an early decompression. At the end, both the categories, or rather all the 3 categories, may require corrective surgery for rehabilitation. We'll come to that later. Now, the European Union study, it gives a dictate that the cumulative dose of intravenous steroids should be less than 8 grams in one course of therapy. If there is only inflammation, then 0.5 gram per day once a week, with a cumulative dose not more than 4.5 grams over 12 weeks. It is only for severe disease, or if there is constant diplopia, that a higher dose may be required, where you raise the cumulative dose to 7.5 grams over 12 weeks, and in no case should the cumulative dose go more than 8 grams. Now, talking of selenium, it is an antioxidant, and it has come under a lot of discussion. But nowadays, the consensus is that for mild disease, you give 200 micrograms per day for 6 months because of its antioxidant effect, and it has been seen to reduce thyroid autoantibodies. And this in turn reduces the severity of the disease, which in turn improves the quality of life. Now, temporary treatment for eyelid retraction is either by steroids or by using botulinum toxin. This is one of my patients where we gave her botulinum toxin in her left upper lid, and the lid came down definitely, but not completely. So you need to repeat botulinum toxin like for all other indications. To this, we can also add either steroids or fillers. And the mechanism of action for orbital radiation is basically that it destroys the lymphocytes. And there's a further destruction of tissues. And 20 Gui is given in 10 divided doses over 2 weeks. I personally have never used orbital radiation. So let's go through an overview of the surgical intervention. When do you go for surgery? Up until now, the mild and moderate disease can be very easily tackled by medical therapy. They keep coming back to you with exacerbations and quiescent phases. According to that, calculate their CAS score and their UGOGO score, and accordingly, you taper the medication or you increase the medication. You dabble between NSAIDs and steroids, giving them a supplement of either oral or intravenous. Oral is actually not preferred. It's better to give them a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory orally. But despite your best efforts, about 5% of your patients will require surgical intervention, but it is only done, please remember, it is only done after medical therapy is exhausted or as an elective procedure during the quiescent stage. Surgery is never the first choice of treatment except for an emergency optic nerve decompression where, again, the medical treatment has failed. It is done as orbital decompression, strabismus surgery, lid lengthening surgery, and blepharoplasty. So strabismus surgery is done only when you have the patient stable for at least 6 months, not before that. So let's take a small journey into what is orbital decompression. Why do we require orbital decompression? We require it because the tissues inside have either pushed our eyeball outside such that our eyelids don't close, or else such that it is causing a cosmetic dysfunction, or else that the functions of the orbital tissues like external ocular movements and vision from the optic nerve, they are compromised. So here I have written something which is concept of the first wall. The concept of the first wall is that till now it was thought that to decompress the orbit, we need to increase the space. But then the thinking changed, and it was put forward that if we reduce the extra amount of fat that has come into the tissue by virtue of adipogenesis, that would suffice to reduce the pressure within. And that is why it was thought that it is not the bone that is the first wall, it is the fat that is the first wall. So that was the concept of the first wall, that orbital fat that has increased, that is removed. Now, if you see this radiology, these are MR scans, you see the white part is the fat. And when you compare it in coronal section with the muscles which are black, you see that the fat is so much more than the muscles. The muscles are not so dilated. So the muscles don't need space. If you can take out the fat, then the space is already decompressed. And that is what was called the first wall. And you must remember, friends, it is applicable for mild proptosis only. You can't be doing fat decompression in severe orbitopathy. Why? Because in sight-threatening orbitopathy, the compression is in the posterior part of the orbit. And this majorly compresses the anterior part of the orbit. Now, in 2011, a new technique was described by Jeffrey Rose for the lateral wall decompression, where instead of taking out the whole lateral wall and leaving it just under the temporalis muscle, the anterior rim was spared. And they found that in moderate cases, it had very good results. But for severe proptosis, we still needed to remove more than two walls. This is called the 2.5 wall decompression. So what are the 2.5 walls? The two full walls that are removed are the medial wall and the lateral wall. And the medial half of the floor of the orbit, which is thin and in continuation with the medial wall, that part is also reduced. So in severe proptosis, you have a medial plus medial half of the floor plus the lateral wall for severe proptosis. Now, when there is sight-threatening orbitopathy, what is most important is the medial wall and the medial half of the floor right behind till the optic canal. Now, this can be done transorbitally or it can be done transnasally with the endoscope. Now, you see these images. These are CT scan images. You see there is apical crowding and there is straightening of the optic nerve and a thickening of the optic nerve. So if you decompress this increased fat, it is not going to serve your purpose. You will have to decompress this wall here. You will have to make space here in the medial part for this optic nerve to be able to function. So for all patients of Graves' ophthalmopathy, this is a quick run through. The first thing that you need to do is you need to restore euthyroidism. You need to urge them to stop smoking. You need to refer them to specialist centers, even except for very mild disease. Mild disease you treat as an ophthalmologist, where you know the patient is euthyroid, keep them under your follow-up. But if they have moderate disease, if they have thyroid dysfunction, as in a systemic hypo or hyper, please engage with an endocrinologist and an immunologist, because you will need immune modulation. You will need them to get their scans. You need a radiologist on your team. So it becomes a patient-centric, multidisciplinary approach. Up until now, what was it? It was disciplinary approach. Ophthalmologist ke gaya, usne kaha usko dekh lo, usne kaha usko dekh lo. It doesn't work like that. So now, on the day that the patient comes to you, he has to have access to an endocrinologist, to an immunologist, to a radiologist, so that you can interact and find out what is the effect of the drug that they are going to use on your orbitopathy. Suppose the surgeon says that I need this patient to get an iodine therapy. Now we know that radioactive iodine is known to exacerbate the thyroid ophthalmopathy. So immediately we will up our disease treatment and take measures. If we need to do a tarsorrhaphy, we'll do a tarsorrhaphy. If we need to increase the frequency of lubricants or add a topical steroid, we'll do that. If we need to protect the cornea, we give him a BCL. So in that manner, you need to have a multidisciplinary approach. So I've just made an algorithm for everybody. It is something like a repetition of the previous algorithm, that the mild disease, local measures, wait and see. If it progresses to moderate to severe, again, you go for IV steroids. If it is inactive, then you go to the rehabilitative stage. Here again, the inactive, like suppose your eyelid retraction has become stable, and now it is not responding to botulinum toxin either because of the fibrosis. Then you do a small levator surgery for that, and you weaken the levator and create some amount of ptosis so that the retraction can be taken care of. Similarly, if the patient has sight-threatening disease, then you go into a higher, more aggressive glucocorticoid therapy, prompt decompression, and again manage till the patient reaches the stable state. Now at KGMU, I have been involved in working on thyroid disease now for more than a decade. We run a separate thyroid eye clinic. And with the help of my residents, we have analyzed our data. There is a definite female preponderance, and the age group ranges from the second to the third decade. Unlike the West, we see more of mild disease, which is commonest. Amongst the signs, it is the conjunctival signs and the dry eye, which is the most common. In fact, it is interesting to note that our data analysis showed that a lot of patients who had been treated at various places as dry eye actually had an underlying thyroid disease. So I would say that in perimenopausal women, where there is dry eye, please get their thyroids evaluated. If there are young adults who have dry eye, why should a young adult have a dry eye? Please look for the thyroid. Secondary open-angle glaucoma is a very common feature in moderate disease. And luckily for us, sight-threatening orbitopathy, because of optic nerve compression, is rare. I have seen visual loss, I have seen eye loss because of corneal involvement, but not so often because of optic nerve compression. Although the West reports a higher incidence. And in my practice, decompression is indicated mainly for cosmetic reasons. The quality of life is definitely affected in patients of thyroid ophthalmopathy. They have a very high oxidative stress. This was reported in the journal Orbit. And it is interesting to note that this oxidative stress, despite the patient reaching a euthyroid status, it comes down, but it never comes to its normal level. So patients of thyroid ophthalmopathy must get an antioxidant supplementation. In one of our researches, we also found that the retinal nerve fiber layer gets thickened in one stage and gets atrophic in the other stage. Actually, when there is compression in the orbital tissue, the optic nerve gets compressed, so the exoplasmic flow that gets stagnated, and that is which reflects as a thickening of the retinal nerve fibers. But when this inflammation subsides and the exoplasmic flow is restored, or the constant pressure leads to atrophy, then you get a second phase where there is retinal nerve fiber layer loss. And this has been published and proven on OCT. The resistive index in the ophthalmic artery is increased, which again has a bearing on the retinal nerve fibers. This thesis got an award. Dr. Sukriti was the resident. And recently, our publication on corneal hysteresis showing that corneal hysteresis is affected in thyroid ophthalmopathy. has been published again in the Orbit. It has been a very interesting journey, friends, and I must acknowledge the contribution of my residents, especially Dr. Sukant Pandey, Dr. Mugdha Kumari, Dr. Sukriti, Dr. Swati, Dr. Nitika, Dr. Ankita's name is missing from here. Dr. Ankita, Dr. Shailja Mishra, Dr. Stuti, Dr. Saxena, Dr. Manoj Kumar, Dr. Madhukar Mittal, they are my colleagues, and our patients. So the message at the end of this nearly 45-minute talk is that thyroid ophthalmopathy is not a one-time disease. It is not that you have seen it and you are done with the diagnosis. No, you have to regularly call the follow-up. Initially, you call them in the active stage for weekly or bi-weekly, depending upon what is their issue that you have to monitor. Suppose a patient has corneal stain positive areas, you call them weekly. Suppose their pressure is high, then again you call them weekly, till their therapy is tailored. You have to stick to a multi-speciality approach. The understanding of pathophysiology is extremely important. And please remember that there is no one size fits all treatment in thyroid ophthalmopathy. You have to customize. You may need surgical intervention in the form of tarsorrhaphies. You may need a BCL. You may not need a BCL. You may need protective glasses. You may need lubricants. You may need humidifiers. Any and everything would be decided by the patient's situation. I think I have taken you fairly widely through the basics and the points which are important from a practitioner's point of view who is not an exclusive oculoplastic surgeon. I did not want to make it a purely surgical talk because the surgical part is very limited and surgeries as such are exhaustive and not being carried out by almost everybody. So there's a very small segment that would have benefited had I gone through that aspect of the talk. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.